2 years ago, we published a documentary titled Who's Telling the Truth About Disco Elysium, in which we set out to investigate whether or not this beloved RPG had been stolen from the original creator of the Elysium world, Robert Kurvitz, as well as the game's art director and fellow Zaum shareholder, Alexander Rostov, after they'd been fired from their own studio, along with another of Disco's writers, Helen Hindper. These firings in late 2021 came as a huge shock to fans, in part because it all seemed so sudden, but also the release of Disco Elysium had happened just 2 years prior and had been outrageously successful. So if these three were now getting kicked out of Zaum, what on earth had been happening behind the scenes? Over the course of about 2.5 hours, our documentary sought to answer that very question, and honestly, we weren't expecting to return to this story until at least those legal disputes had been resolved, which they haven't, by the way, although there has been some progress, and we'll discuss that in just a little bit. But to put it bluntly, so much has now happened in this saga that it no longer feels appropriate to wait. That means today we're going to get you up to speed on everything that's taken place since our original investigation was published, with a total of four different companies having now sprung up outside of Zaum in order to create Disco Elysium spiritual successors of their own. And then there's Zaum itself. What state is that company in now that it's pulled the plug on a sequel to Disco Elysium and laid off at least a quarter of its employees? Things were very messy when we covered this topic in 2023. Where are we at now? Later on, you'll also see me travel to Croatia to meet one of our key interviewees from last time around, Disco Elysium writer Argo Tulik, as well as another former Zaum employee, Dora Klinjic, who were both, for a time, leading a team within that company working on a brand new Disco Elysium game. These last 2 years have proven extremely turbulent for the pair of them, and Argo's feelings towards Zaum's leadership have, well, they've clearly shifted quite a bit since I last spoke to him. We'll be getting into all of that, plus Argo and Dora now represent one of these new groups that has split away from Zaum, and because this is Disco, they're also being sued by one of their competitors, who they themselves used to work for, sort of. And the pair face financial ruin should they prove unable to win that case. But before we get stuck into all of that, I need to talk about something else as well. With a couple of years of hindsight, I think it's probably about time I share my own feelings about that original documentary, or to put it more bluntly, I'd like to address some of the criticism that it's now received. So when we first published the video, the response was really positive. I think it had something like a 98% like to dislike ratio during its first few months on the channel. But as time passed and as the Disco Elysium shitstorm continued to rage onwards and outwards, we began to receive this slow but steady drip feed of pushback from viewers. To quote a comment I must have now seen posted dozens of times, this video aged like milk. If I were to boil down the main criticisms that have been voiced, it'd be this. The documentary went too easy on the forces of capital. By investigating allegations of financial fraud at Zaum alongside the opposing allegations surrounding Robert Kurvitz's behaviour within the workplace, we were essentially conflating these two things. The argument then being that our video was unjustly making the case that because Kurvitz may have mistreated his co-workers, it's somehow fair or right that his life's work has now been stripped away from him. And then there's my personal reaction to a statement made by Kurvitz at the very end of our documentary as well, a statement I clearly find frustrating. Where is that same outrage from me when it comes to these other aspects of the story? I have complicated feelings about each of those criticisms, but before I get into that, first of all, let me say this. I do think we got something wrong. That's not to say that I agree with every argument that's been put forth. I think there's some bad faith stuff out there as well. But overall, this sense of frustration that's bubbled up, totally valid. And I think, in my opinion, it stems from a very central mistake we made in that documentary that I'd like to talk about here. Okay, quick bit of context first to try and get everyone up to speed, because it was a while ago that we published this documentary. Back then when we first published, I think, as far as I could tell, the most common opinion amongst viewers was that we'd helped flesh out a story that had, so far at least, been sort of oversimplified in its telling. As well as getting a bunch of the key players on camera answering questions, we were able to accomplish a couple of really useful things. First of all, we pulled apart this confusing labyrinth of company structures surrounding Disco Elysium as an intellectual property, and in doing so, shone a spotlight on the most questionable aspects of how Ilmar Kompas, the current CEO of Zaum, had become its majority owner. And we also gave Zaum's employees, not just the shareholders, but salaried employees, the opportunity to share their own perspective on working at this company and working directly with Kurvitz, Rostov, and Hindper. Up until that point, the prevailing narrative had been that the three of them had all been forced out of Zaum as part of a larger scheme to seize control of the company and pry its most valuable asset, Disco Elysium, away from them. To quote the explosive blog post from Kurvitz and Rostov at the time, Helen's name wasn't attached to this, "Our firing came weeks after we started asking for documents and financial data, which is still being kept from us." The pair alleged that Ilmar Kompas and his business partner Thomas Harvel had snatched control of Zaum via a series of fraudulent transactions, including some which saw Kompas tapping into company funds unbeknownst to them. When they did find out and they started asking questions, Kompas fired them. That's their claim. Now, I've examined this particular moment in Zaum's history more than most, and I still can't tell you right now definitively whether or not that allegation is true. What I can say is that our reporting discovered significant issues in the way in which both sides of this dispute had presented their version of events. First of all, although Kurvitz and Rostov say they were fired because they'd been asking too many questions, we'd eventually hear some important additional context from 4 of the people who'd worked most closely with them at Zaum. These former colleagues of theirs told us that Robert's behaviour in particular had created significant problems at the company, and by the end, it wasn't a huge surprise that he'd been fired. That complicated things, as did the existence of a British company called New Elysium Limited, which was allegedly in possession of the IP rights to a Disco Elysium sequel. Even after they were fired, Kurvitz and Rostov each owned a 20% stake in this company, which was a significantly higher percentage than their stake in the original game. Why was that? Well, Ilmar Kompas claimed that this had all been agreed as part of a deal in which Kurvitz, Rostov and the other Zaum owners had backed his plan to buy out another shareholder. He argued that the existence of this other company, New Elysium, was proof that some kind of understanding must have existed between them, because if his goal had been to simply steal Disco Elysium away from under Kurvitz and Rostov, why would he have then given them a bigger slice of the game's sequel? Okay, but on the flip side to that, we know at the moment there is no Disco Elysium sequel in the works, so that 20% stake, well, it's not proving particularly lucrative. And it remains alarming that no paper trail exists to back any of this stuff up, really. This was a crucial discovery in our documentary, the eyebrow-raising absence of any written proof from Ilmar Kompas for the supposed agreements that led to him taking control of Zaum. This absence that's only made more glaring by a now infamous transaction in which Kompas is meant to have sold a non-disco related intellectual property to Zaum for the best part of €5 million, having previously bought it from the company for just £1. He claims the other shareholders had verbally agreed to this because he'd need to eventually pay this money back and because they were getting this increased stake in the future profits of Disco Elysium too. But where's the documentation showing that everyone was actually on board? I'm still yet to hear a convincing answer to that question. We've skimmed over a ton of detail there, but that's sort of a top level breakdown of what our reporting uncovered. And as I said before, to begin with, the added nuance was largely welcomed, but by the end of 2023, something in that milk had begun to sour. It's not that there'd been zero criticism beforehand, but particularly in the aftermath of a video response from the Disco Elysium YouTuber Jamrock Hobo in late 2023, and then shortly afterwards, as news then broke that Zaum had laid off a quarter of its staff, negative sentiment surrounding our documentary grew louder. At first I wasn't quite sure what to make of this backlash. I wondered if our work had perhaps become this sort of lightning rod for Disco Elysium fans who were frustrated at the mismanagement they saw at Zaum and who hated the fact that Robert Kurvitz was no longer able to work on the story of Disco Elysium. Maybe these comments weren't actually angry with our reporting, maybe they were just angry. But of course, the longer I sat with that thought, the less it really held up. And so after 2 years of thinking about this video that we made a lot, here's where I believe we dropped the ball. Looking back at the documentary, it was structured in a very particular way that allowed us to focus on each group of interviews separately. So we hear from Ilmar first, then the Zaum employees, and then Robert and the others who'd been fired. And we did it this way because it felt useful to remind our audience that we'd, for example, interviewed Ilmar earlier in this process than we had Robert. And so by the time we get to that final section, we've actually amassed all this new information that's now going to be relevant to that later interview. It also felt like there was something important to be gained from preserving the overall vibe of these conversations as well. By keeping each of the interviews somewhat self-contained, I think you get a better sense of who these people are and how they're feeling in the moment. I think the reason Argo's section really resonated with people is because you got to follow this complicated emotional arc with him as he goes from reminiscing about being a teenager in Estonia, how close he and Robert were as young men, to how exciting it was to be working on Disco, only for that work to then take this huge toll on the both of them, and ultimately their relationship as well.
I don't think he understood that to lead is a burden, not a privilege. I disagreed with Robert's version of events that went down. I felt that the way it was presented was dishonest and manipulative.
When Argo accuses Robert of being dishonest and manipulative, I think it matters that we're able to absorb all this surrounding context from the rest of his interview in order to appreciate why it matters that Argo says this about the person he grew up with. And it felt easier to build up that context brick by brick if we weren't constantly flicking between different interviews. But in doing so, and especially due to the length of the overall video, we've come to realize that this decision to keep the interviews largely separate from one another also deprives the audience from being able to see some of the story's biggest juxtapositions on screen, side by side, for themselves. I think in hindsight, this sometimes means the documentary runs the risk of distorting how it presents certain allegations compared to others. Let me quickly show you an example of what I mean. We're going to zoom in for a moment on Ilmar Kompas answering my question about whether or not the other shareholders like Kurvitz and Rostov had agreed to him using company funds in order to become the majority owner of Zaum. This is a critical moment in our piece. We're then going to immediately cut to the voice you'd most want to hear respond to what Ilmar has just said. Okay, let's run those two clips.
It was done in an agreement with each other. It was done in the interest of everybody, and everybody gained from that.
I, at that time, didn't even know that he has bought out the company.
There we go. There's two very contrasting statements that you, as the viewer, now get to consider side by side. But that's not actually how we ran those two clips in our documentary. Instead, we did this.
It was done in an agreement with each other. It was done in the interest of everybody, and everybody gained from that.
I, at that time, didn't even know that he has bought out the company.
That's over an hour in which you're not able to hear Robert Kurvitz respond to one of the most important things being said about him. Our video structure was meant to let us delve into each of the different aspects of this story one by one. You've got the ownership of Zaum, and then these allegations of financial fraud. You've got a group of workers from the company saying, wait, there are genuine problems with the people who were fired. And then finally, our big interview with the trio right at the center of this maelstrom who eventually get to respond to everything you've heard in the documentary so far. And yeah, I think there are some sensible sounding reasons for why we did it this way. I'm sure I made some of those arguments way back when, but in reality, we just end up with this huge delay before Kurvitz, Rostov, and Himper are able to make their case for what happened. And this problem isn't helped by a section featuring the Zaum employees, which separates Ilmar's interview from Robert and the rest, effectively needing to slam the brakes on the question of whether or not Ilmar Kompas had committed fraud. Because the employees I interviewed weren't privy to any discussions at that kind of level, they weren't shareholders, and so they didn't have much to say about it. What they could talk about instead is how they felt they were mistreated by Kurvitz and the others, which is an important part of this story, but by constructing the edit in this way, it means that for about 40 minutes, our documentary just stops talking about whether or not Ilmar Kompas stole Zaum. And then, by the time we do hear from Kurvitz and the others on this, there's now this sense that these allegations of fraud are now perhaps secondary to what we've just spent the last 40 minutes thinking about. This may not have been such a problem in a shorter documentary, but when the total runtime is 2.5 hours, the issue really gets amplified. I think if we constructed this video in a way that allowed us to more readily jump between different interviews where needed, we would have ended up doing better work. That could have come with the added benefit of giving viewers just more space to make their own mind up on what they've just heard, rather than me needing to jump in and summarize something that you last heard an hour ago, because we're about to return to that in a separate interview now. Whilst we're on the topic of my input, let's also discuss a moment during the documentary's conclusion in which I'm visibly frustrated with an email I just received from Robert Kurvitz. I think this email is outrageous. I really don't like where it's coming from. By writing off the experiences of his peers in this way, by claiming they're just being used as tools by criminal businessmen, it completely ignores the fact that they're actually people with their own perspectives, their own feelings, their own grievances. And I find it massively disrespectful. It shows almost no empathy towards them. The email I'm referring to here is Robert's response to the allegations put forward by his former colleagues, which he dismisses outright as just a last-minute attempt by Ilmar Kompas to discredit him. I described this as outrageous at the time because, from my perspective, even if Robert felt he was unable to admit to any wrongdoing because of the ongoing legal battles he was facing, there is an important difference between declining to comment and describing your former colleagues in this way. However, what we've now heard from some viewers is, hey, why weren't you this upset about Ilmar's story? Where was the outrage for that bit? And you know what? There's some fair criticism there. Although I think we did do a good job of conveying our misgivings surrounding Ilmar's own narrative, I'm clearly at my most emotive on that topic during the first hour of the documentary, and not the last. It was in many ways a frustrating interview. The idea that there's nothing in writing that can show that the other shareholders approved of this, it just doesn't hold up. As for Dennis Harville's involvement and the financial link between Zaum and his partner Annie Raymond, it all speaks to a way of doing business that is ultimately dishonest. By the time we reach this conclusion, it's been over 90 minutes since we drilled into the details of Ilmar's version of events and called out this idea of him verbally agreeing with other shareholders that he'd be able to do these different transactions. And that leaves us once again right at the end of the documentary with a sense of imbalance, I think. So with all that being said, if you were left feeling a bit off in the aftermath of watching our Disco Elysium doc, I think that's probably fair. It's taken me a while to reach that conclusion, honestly. I found it confusing to wrap my head around this documentary featuring what I saw as some of our best work, but at the same time, I can now see structurally, it's a bit of a weird thing to watch. We had many of the right pieces, I'd argue, but we didn't always place them in the correct order, and I'm just frustrated about that, honestly. Finally, there's just one more quick thing I'd like to mention before we can start moving this story forwards again. I don't think we always did right by Helen Himper in that first documentary either. There's a couple of moments I'd like to highlight on that front. First of all, during our interview, she described a moment in which Ilmar's business partner and Zaum's executive producer, Dennis Harville, had screamed at her during a call and told her that people like her didn't have what it takes to be a leader. She said the shouting had been so intense that another writer in the room had overheard and come over to ask who was on the other side of the call. We included this clip in our documentary because it felt like an important allegation about Thonis's own behavior within the studio and how he treats employees, maybe how he treats female employees in particular. But we didn't corroborate the story any further and give it that extra credibility that it probably required. And we've since learned that the other writer that Helen mentions was in fact Argo Tulik, who has said this in a more recent interview with the Disco Elysium YouTuber, The 41st Precinct.
This incident that Ellen is referring, where Dennis is screaming at her and a rider comes in that I am that rider. I witnessed this incident occurring.
We should have been the ones to find that out from Argo ourselves, and we should have also been the ones to take that allegation to Thonis and Zaum directly. So let's do that now. We emailed the Zaum executive team about Helen's allegation, including Thonis, who you'll sometimes hear referred to as Dennis during this documentary, as that's the name he often goes by in the UK. I asked him if this was a moment that Thonis recalled and whether or not he'd like to offer his own perspective as to what had happened, but he didn't reply to my questions himself. Later on, I would get a response from Zaum, but that response was a decline to comment. Helen also claimed that Ilmar and the other executives at Zaum abused UK labour laws in order to prevent her from becoming a full-time employee within the company, and in doing so, made it that much easier to get rid of her later down the line. She told PMG in a written statement that they managed to do this by changing the corporate entities that were employing me every 2 years over the course of my 5 years of employment within the studio. I also don't think we examined this allegation closely enough first time around, so let's do that now. Okay, so as far as I understand, this is the employment path that Helen took during this period. She had originally been hired back in the early days by the original Fortress Occident company in Estonia, which would eventually go on to be renamed Zaum Studio. However, when she moved to the UK in 2018, she was then employed by a British company called Zaum London Limited. Looking at its public records on Companies House, this appears to now be something of a dormant company. That's because the following year, in 2019, her employer shifted once again to another British company called Disco Elysium UK Limited, now known as Zaum Studio Limited, which remains today the main sort of British entity of Zaum and is the named employer for, as far as I'm aware, most of the staff working in this country. However, in Helen's case, because she'd been working for this new entity for a period of less than 2 years by the time she was eventually dismissed, she is correct in saying that under current UK labour laws, she would not have acquired the full employment rights that come with what the UK describes as 2 years of continuous employment, despite having been employed by those other Zaum companies beforehand. We have since asked Zaum to comment on Helen's allegation that this switching of employers made it that much easier to remove her from the company once the time came, but the studio declined to comment once again. I think Helen's own story often gets bundled up with Kurvitz and Rostov's as she was fired alongside them and because of her relationship with Robert, but her story has some really important differences, including the fact that she was never a Zaum shareholder. And looking back at it now, I think we could have done a bit more to reflect that in our work. All right, I think that's all I have to say about our previous doc. It was a complicated story and I'm proud of a lot of the work that we did, but I've also had 2 years now to think about all the stuff I wish we'd done differently. Telling stories like this one is just a massive responsibility. These are people's actual lives that we're rifling through here, and it's on me to hold up my hands and tell you when I think we've misstepped. So yeah, this is me doing exactly that, and thank you for sticking with this part of the video. I'm sorry if it was long or if it felt self-indulgent or any of those things. It also was just, from my perspective, important to talk about, and I appreciate you hearing me out. Cool. With all that being said, what on earth happened next? Let's kick things off with Robert Kurvitz's court battle with Zaum, as there's a fairly significant update on that front. During our first documentary in 2023, I travelled to Estonia to attend one of the hearings in this case myself, in which Kurvitz was demanding access to a range of Zaum's financial records, including bank statements, contracts, invoices, and loan agreements, which he claimed he would need in order to prove that company funds had been stolen. I watched as his lawyers argued that as a shareholder, Kurvitz had a right to access this documentation, whereas the company's position was that Robert Kurvitz should now be considered a direct competitor to Zaum, having founded a new game studio since his dismissal. And so, by sharing such an extensive look into the company's finances, it could pose a material risk to Zaum. It's taken a full 2.5 years to get through the Estonian courts, but a ruling was finally made in December of last year in favour of Robert Kurvitz. Zaum has been ordered to hand over the vast majority of the records that he'd requested. What happens next will come down to what exactly Kurvitz is able to find in these documents, and whether or not he believes there's enough to build a case. If he does believe that, presumably we're looking at a much more significant lawsuit being filed in the months to come. Alternatively, if nothing meaningful is discovered, this could also be the end of the line when it comes to the court's involvement in this dispute. We're just going to have to wait and see. There are a few other details from this first ruling worth mentioning, however. First of all, we should clarify that the court isn't making any kind of larger judgment here on whether or not Zaum or Disco Elysium have actually been stolen. It's very specifically been a case about Kurvitz wanting to access certain company records. That's the extent of the judgment. With that being said, both Zaum and Robert Kurvitz did attempt to make their wider arguments as well in order to influence the court's verdict here, and in both cases, they were largely unsuccessful. Zaum argued that Kurvitz had also attempted to damage the company in the past while still in play by conspiring to take Disco Elysium with him to another game studio. This was one of the big reasons that Zaum's management first gave publicly as to why Robert had been fired. The court's ruling notes that the only proof Zaum provided for this allegation was the termination having happened and the fact that Robert Kurvitz had initially raised an unfair dismissal case against the company, which he later withdrew. Neither of these events on their own were enough to convince the court, with the judge explaining that Kurvitz withdrawing that unfair dismissal claim does not then automatically mean he's agreeing with every stated reason the company has given for why he was fired. On the other side of the table, Kurvitz also looked to convince the court that Zaum CEO Ilmar Kompas had misused company finances in order to become the majority shareholder of the company. Again, the court was not satisfied by the evidence put forward that these transfers were in fact unlawful or that they could be considered a misuse of company assets. Now, to be crystal clear, this does not mean that we've necessarily heard either side make its argument in full. It may be that more substantial evidence is put forward when a more substantial lawsuit is actually filed, if it's filed. But I did find these first few skirmishes interesting. They reminded me, honestly, of some of the issues that we'd encountered in our own reporting on this topic 2 years ago when trying to pick apart these two contrasting sets of allegations. In short, where's the proof? At least on the Robert Kurvitz side of this dispute, I mean, this first ruling is potentially about gaining access to documentation where that proof may exist. On the Zaum side of things, its allegations, particularly this one about stealing the Disco Elysium IP and taking it elsewhere, the details have always been hazy. We've never really even heard which developer, which publisher is meant to be involved. Perhaps that will come up at a later date, but it didn't come up in this ruling. I think it's probably time we talked about the many different companies currently vying to make a spiritual successor to Disco Elysium. Not all of them will describe it in those terms, but that's certainly how it's being perceived. In 2023, there were just two. It was a simpler time, honestly. You had Zaum and you had Red Info Box. Now just Red Info, this new studio that's being created by Robert Kurvitz and former art director of Zaum, Alexander Rostov. As I record this video, there are currently 5 contenders for the throne, and each of them offer varying levels of legitimacy when it comes to who's involved and what their history is with Disco Elysium. Based on my own reporting, here's what I know about each of them in turn. Let's start with Zaum, as it remains the only studio in this list that could, right now, feasibly come out and make a game called Disco Elysium 2. While as it stands today, That is just not on the cards. Following the firing of Kravitz, Rostov, and former Zaum writer Helen Himper in 2021, work had continued on a direct sequel for several months, but this was eventually canned. We asked Zaum why the sequel had been cancelled, to which the studio responded, "While Elysium certainly deserves further exploration, both for creative and commercial reasons, we decided to pursue alternative projects at the time." It's perhaps worth reminding ourselves here that if Zaum did develop Disco Elysium 2, Kravitz and Rostov both still maintain their stake in a company called New Elysium Limited, which is meant to house the rights to any potential sequel to Disco Elysium. I imagine that's not considered an ideal outcome for those other shareholders. However, if the company wished to create an entirely new game set within the Elysium world that wasn't Disco Elysium 2 in order to bypass this arrangement, I'm told Zaum would need to renegotiate its licensing agreement with Robert Kravitz in order to do so. For obvious reasons, this isn't presently considered a viable option. But there is a third avenue available to Zaum, and it's one the company had been pursuing for a while. Using the existing licensing rights for Disco Elysium, the company had played around with the idea of creating additional content for that original game. This has covered tiny updates like the collage mode, for example, as well as new versions of the game like the one that's just landed on Android. But Zaum is also confident that this would extend to what you might call a standalone expansion or a spin-off. Now this is a bit of a fiddly definition, but to quote one executive at Zaum, this could only work if it demonstrated a direct connection and association with Disco Elysium 1, and it'd probably need to reference the original game in its title as well. So think a flashback to the early days of Everett Clare and the Hardy Boys, rather than a game that could leave Revachol and these specific characters behind entirely. Which is how Zaum ended up with Locust City, an Elysium story in development. This had been pitched internally in 2022 by Disco Elysium writer Argo Tulik and another writer, Dora Klinjik, who joined Zaum more recently to work on Disco sequel. Locust City would have continued the story of Kuno and Kuno S, with the player being able to switch between either character as they played. Codenamed X7, it was in development for just under 2 years before it too was cancelled and many of the people involved laid off. And when this happened, Argo and Dora immediately took their frustrations to the press, with Argo going as far as saying that Zaum would forever stay a one-game studio, and that the individuals of Zaum, the cultural movement, have left the corporate body behind like the king cobra slithering out of its dead skin. Dora added this: "What remains at Zaum is a cold, careless company where managers wage war against their own creatives, where artistry is second to property, and where corporate strategy is formed by an arrogant disdain for their own audience." Damn, what's that Mark Twain quote? "The history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." Well, we're going to hear from the pair later on about whether or not this experience has reshaped what Argo once told me about what happened between Zaum and Robert, Rostov, and Helen. More recently, in March of this year, Zaum revealed a teaser for its next game, currently known as Project C4, and in doing so, caught the ire of some fans thanks to the trailer's opening words, "We are Zaum, we bought you Disco Elysium." Something of a loaded statement there, all things considered. Seathor isn't set within the Elysium world, but this trailer is certainly looking to exude the same sort of energy, with what looks to be Anton Wil's work, he's the artist behind Disco Elysium's Thought Cabinet, being pushed front and center. Zaum describes C4 as a mind-warping story of espionage and team building in an original yet achingly familiar setting. The release date for Zaum's Project C4 is not yet known. Aside from Anton, there are still several people at Zaum who contributed to either Disco Elysium or Final Cut, including Justin Keenan, Casper Tamzulu, Sim Cineme, Chris Priestman, Petteri Salonen, and of course, Jonas Harvel. Each of them now holds senior roles within the studio. However, it is also worth saying that if you look at the original game's credits, not Final Cut, but the original Disco Elysium, and at the writers in particular, there isn't actually anybody left from these top two groups anymore. You'll need to scroll down to the additional writing credits to find folks who still work there. Moving on to Red Int though, we know it trademarked the name Corinthians in late 2022, and that Helen Himper now has a smaller stake in the company as well, alongside Kravitz and Rostov. Red Int though quietly received an initial investment of just over $10 million from the Chinese publisher NetEase Games, which is worth paying extra attention to right now because that's the same company which is thought to be going through some major upheaval when it comes to the types of projects it funds. According to a recent Bloomberg report, NetEase intends to cut down on the investments it makes outside of China, and going forwards will mostly be prioritizing games that have the potential to generate hundreds of millions of dollars. How exactly a small non-Chinese team like Red Int though fits into these new plans is unclear. Redinfo declined to comment on the investments it's received to date. I've also heard from multiple sources that Chris Avallone is working with the Redinfo team as well. The American game designer and writer has an unbelievable track record of games, including Fallout 2, Planescape Torment, Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, KOTOR 2, Fallout New Vegas, the list goes on and on. In mid-2020, however, Avallone was accused by multiple women of sexual misconduct and groping while attending game industry networking events. Initially, Avallone apologized to some of the women who'd come forward, but he'd later begin a libel suit against 2 of them. This was eventually settled in 2023, with the 2 women agreeing to pay him a 7-figure amount, as well as publicly retracting their allegations in a joint statement. I think it's fair to say that Avallone hasn't exactly been getting the same kind of work since all of this happened, and in fact, he was very publicly dropped by one client in the aftermath of these accusations first being aired. And so his involvement with Redinfo here feels significant. We didn't hear back from Chris Avallone on his work with Redinfo, while the studio itself declined to comment. However, while editing this documentary, Avallone does now appear to have confirmed his involvement with the studio in an article published by the Financial Times. For many fans, if Redinfo is able to release a game, it will be considered the truest successor to Disco Elysium, because ultimately it will be the only one to contain new writing from Robert Kurwitz. That being said, it may take a while.
I think a world needs to be built for at least 5 years before showtime. At least 5 years before you get into the project, until you start using it in a game.
Next up, we have Dark Math Games. This studio was set up by former Zaum shareholder Kaur Kender in 2023, and Kaur, you may remember from our first doc, has quite the history. He was taken to court by the Estonian government in 2016 for a novel he'd written called Untitled 12, which includes extremely graphic, third-person depictions of, amongst other things, the rape and murder of child prostitutes by the novel's protagonist. Kender was charged with the production of child pornography after its publication, but following a high-profile legal battle which prompted its own national discourse on freedom of speech within Estonia, he successfully defended his right to publish a story that he claimed was designed to horrify and disturb its readers. I mention all of this again because there's been a somewhat unexpected update on Untitled 12. Kaur has now claimed that Robert was in fact the true author of the novel, making the following statement on the RPG Codex forums of all places. Robert was afraid to post it under his own name. He was even afraid to save his work on his computer's hard drive, so he carried it around on a memory stick. Go figure why. I bought him off, as always. He got a brand new 17-inch Alienware laptop, which became his main tool for writing Disco Elysium, and he got my word that when we'll publish it under my name, I'd bite the bullet if the state came after us. The state did come after us. I took the bullet, never snitched, and I got acquitted. So if you want to make a game about Untitled 12, feel free to contact Robert. I haven't even read it, I'm just a shitposter. Kender later reaffirmed this claim to an Estonian newspaper, while Kurwitz said he didn't wish to comment on the topic. Anyway, Untitled 12 aside, following Kender's dramatic exit from Zaum, which you can hear more about in our first documentary, he went on to set up Dark Math Games in order to begin work on a new game called XXX Night Shift. There's something like 20 people working at Dark Math right now. And Night Shift has a Steam page which promises a story set in a luxury Arctic resort in the year 2086. Similarly to Disco, you'll be playing as a cop with a companion, solving gruesome murders, but unlike Disco, that cop is a woman, which the devs have been keen to stress will be a fiery redhead and, hot. The whole vibe across the board really feels significantly hornier. In terms of people who worked on Disco Elysium, you've got Zaum's former motion graphics designer and sheer brick wall of a man, Timo Albert. He's now the Dark Math art director, and there's also Kaur's brother, Heiti, who also has a credit on the final cut, and he's the studio's executive producer. Argo Tulik and Dora Klinchik briefly joined the team after leaving Zaum and were given director roles on Night Shift, although they didn't end up sticking around for very long at all. They claim that this was because of creative differences between themselves and Kaur, which came to a head during a creative workshop in which the studio was trying to decide who the playable character should be. Argo and Dora told me they didn't like the idea of working on a babe and were instead keen to pitch the idea of an older woman with more depth, but things weren't progressing particularly well, and ultimately a writer's room meeting had to be called in which each contributor would come along and bring reference materials for the character they hoped to flesh out. During this meeting, according to Argo and Dora, Kaur Kender was largely dismissive of the other ideas being presented and instead decided to show pictures of his ex-wife, some of which had her wearing a bikini, and said, no, this is the inspiration for our playable character. Here's Dora's take on Kaur's vision. I think he should get to make whatever kind of game he wants to make, and it seems he wants to make a game based on his own sexual experiences. Both Cowkender and Darkmath Games declined to comment when asked about this meeting. However, it was another of Darkmath's investors who would play a big role in the pair leaving, and we'll get onto that later on because, trust me, it deserves the space. But for now, let's introduce Riaz Muller, the founder and CEO of a company called Hyperion Dev, which provides online courses in coding and other fields. He'd invested in Darkmath Games shortly after Argo and Dora had come on board. However, despite this stake in Darkmath, Riaz has also founded simultaneously another games company vying to make another Disco Elysium successor. This studio is called Longdew Games and is currently developing Hopetown, a psychological RPG that will have you playing a volatile journalist exiled to a mining town on the brink. Sounds a lot like a weekend I spent in Durham, honestly. So far, Longdew has raised just over £115,000 through Kickstarter, and when it comes to the involvement of former Disco Elysium contributors, the studio has contracted Martin Luiga, an original member of the Zaum Cultural Association, to work on narrative consultation. They're also working with Lenville Brown, the voice of Disco's narrator.
Stop digging up the past and put all this to rest.
And there's Peter Sobolewski, the former CEO of the Knights of Unity, an outsourcing studio which contributed to Disco Elysium's development. Now here's the sticky bit. Both Argo and Dora briefly worked for Riaz Muller after leaving Darkmath Games. Nobody disputes that fact. What is currently being fought over in court, however, is whether or not the work they did for one of his companies and the contract they signed there should have then prevented them from announcing their own new studio, Summer Eternal, before a certain amount of time had first passed. This is known as a non-compete clause, and when compared to the legal battles surrounding the ownership of Zaum and Disco Elysium, it might sound sort of small fry, but this case has already racked up many tens of thousands of pounds in legal fees, and it's only just getting started. Whoever loses is going to need to pick up that bill, and the implications of this could prove extremely serious for Argo and Dora in particular. More on that later on. When it comes to Summer Eternal, the studio is just getting off the ground really. No game has been formally announced as of yet, but in October of last year, the pair released a manifesto raging at what they saw as, and I quote, the vulgar profiteering of corporate bodies moving like leviathans in the dark, and which proposed a new type of company structure in which control of Summer Eternal would be maintained and its profits shared by a pair of cooperatives housing the creative team and then any other collaborators, with a considerably smaller slice being set aside for traditional investors and a 5% share going to a non-profit controlled by the players of Summer Eternal's games. Again, this is just a promise right now. We don't know how much of it will really materialize, but there is certainly no other company on this list or across the vast majority of the games industry that is structured in this way, and that makes it worth paying attention to, I think. And there we are, 5 different companies making 5 different games, none of which are called Disco Elysium 2. There's at least one lawsuit currently underway with potentially more to come, and everywhere you look, there remains in this story just buckets and buckets of bad blood to be found. And for me at least, as is always the case in this story, there remains so many big questions to be answered, and we can't really do that from here, so I think it's time we catch a plane. All right, so you've heard the broad strokes of everything that's happened since our last documentary aired, and now I think it's time to zoom in on the story of Argo and Dora specifically. The pair of them have had an extremely dramatic couple of years in which they've been involved to some extent in almost all of the studios that we just described. They've lost jobs or been fired on 3 separate occasions. They've moved countries, they've announced Summer Eternal, and today they're looking down the barrel of a severely expensive lawsuit, one they say they can't afford to lose. And that's why I've come here to Zagreb in Croatia to meet them once again. I want to know whether their experience at Zaum has changed the way in which Argo now feels about the interview I conducted with him back in 2023, and whether his feelings towards Robert, Rostov and Hallen have changed given that his own exit from that company, along with Dora's, ended up being similarly explosive. We're also going to drill into the details of this lawsuit as well, because it poses perhaps the biggest threat to the pair's fresh start here in Croatia, where they intend to create a very different type of video games company in Summer Eternal. More than that, the person suing them is not only the owner of Longdew Games, but also a major investor in Darkmath as well. So whatever the result of this suit, the implications for these different successor studios we've just described are massive. It's time to hear from Summer Eternal. I met Argo and Dora at their home in Zagreb, and I should add some extra context here. The two of them are in a relationship, and in fact, Dora was in the room when I first interviewed Argo in 2023, even if she herself didn't appear on camera at the time. Back then, they seemed perfectly content to be working at Zaum, hopeful about the future even. So what had happened?
The way I would describe the atmosphere was there was a feeling that perhaps what happened to Robert, Rostov and Helen was a strange fluke, or perhaps this, they were assuring us that this is, an unprecedented situation that had happened once. Unfortunately, we soon realized that it very much wasn't a fluke what happened to other people, and that there is a certain pattern, I guess, especially to management at Zaum, which ended up deteriorating our project and the working relationships we were in a very similar way to what had happened before.
Okay, as their names have already been mentioned, let's address the elephant in the room. Given the seemingly catastrophic way in which their own time at the studio came to an end, does Argo regret anything he said in our previous documentary about Robert, Rostov and Helen?
Overall, no, honestly, every time I think about back to this interview, the main thing that I regret was not being more specific about Helen's role, because I re-listened to it and I realized that you can listen to it and hear it as if I'm saying that Helen was doing no work during the time that she was a lead writer, which is absolutely not true. She did a lot of work, still did all of her writer duties. It was literally this lead position vacancy that I felt. That was my big regret. I think that none of the things Robert, Rostov or Helen did are actually fireable offenses. Being rude to your colleagues to the degree Robert was, that is not fireable offense. It was unpleasant at times for sure to people, and might have felt inconsiderate, but it is not an equivalent of somebody, I don't know, getting slapped at work or something like that. This not giving credit to other people, again, not a pleasant characteristic, but not a fireable offense in any ways. But no, overall, I stand by all of this stuff. I remember last time when we did this interview, I was super nervous because I felt this two-sided pressure. Like, from one side, I wanted to be honest, and I wanted to be kind of representing my team, or be an embodiment of why you should give us this chance. And the other end, I didn't want to bury Robert. I didn't want to I knew that the management is expecting me to say things, and I had no intention to say this. And even this Robert being toxic, to me, clearly this kind of a thing that they threw out, hoping that somebody would latch on to this. And in the end, when we wrapped it up, and I re-listened to it, I felt that I could not have been more fair to Robert. That, yeah, I have no regrets in that sense.
There were, however, some things that weren't said in our last interview back in 2023, like, for example, that Disco Elysium 2 had already been cancelled for the best part of a year by the time we spoke.
I volunteered. I told the management that I want to represent the workers of the company, so it wouldn't be this one-sided or two-sided situation. And the only instructions I received from their end was make eye contact, don't spoil any existing projects, and don't announce that the sequel is cancelled.
The studio grew from 30 people to 100 over the course of these 4 or 5 months at the beginning of 2022. So majority of those people had joined to work on the sequel to Disco Elysium, which was then just had the rug pulled under them, including myself. I had quit my PhD in physics to come work on the sequel to Disco Elysium. First learning that, okay, the original team has been fired, but, the way everyone was talking about it, it seemed, okay, maybe that was justified. And then when the project itself was rug pulled and it was replaced with what was a really hasty concept, this did not go over well with a large number of people, myself included. It's not even so much the idea that we can't do new IP that's not Elysium, because I do think that that was probably a good decision, but just having it happen in such an abrupt way where you have absolutely no say in the matter was quite challenging. And the quality concerns about obviously this new project that was come up with practically overnight were pretty significant.
This was the beginnings of what we now know as Project C4, the next flagship title from Zaum and its answer to what should follow Disco Elysium. Argo and Dora claim to have had significant issues with this new game when it was first revealed to them, which they say was conceptualized during a writer's retreat to New York. Now, they were both on that same trip, but say they were left out of these initial discussions, which were held by the studio's writing director, art director, Kal Kender, and Kal Kender's partner.
Like Dora said, this idea that you have the vanity to think that in a week in a hotel room, three guys and one of their girlfriend can throw together something that does not trigger alarms in the heads of people who join to work on a sequel to a masterpiece. That is crazy.
There was issue with the team also coming to us and to Argo and saying that they're a bit worried about the new direction, but they heard that the writers are all on board, and we said no, actually we also have quality concerns. Which we then tried raising with theme leads and with management, saying, for example, your depictions of some female characters are quite sexist, and you're lacking some key, game design elements. It's not very well thought through, or some world building elements just don't function or seem to be kind of lifted from disco or kind of unintelligible. Like it seemed very hastily done. But unfortunately, to challenge it was also seen as insolence.
But why hadn't Argo and Dora been more directly involved before this point?
A year before the documentary was filmed, when they canceled the sequel, they needed to really consolidate the new leadership. Mm-hmm. And anyone who kind of felt uncertain or could challenge them, they saw as a threat to this new model of leadership, because it was the fear of having another Robert situation, or of someone who's not fully obedient to management.
We did ask Zaum why Argo in particular hadn't been involved in the early concepting of C4, given his contributions to Disco Elysium and the fact that he was one of the most experienced writers at the company. Here's what we heard back. It was not unusual for Argo to be absent from the genesis of C4. Argo was not employed in a leadership role, but his feedback was requested when C4 was just a kernel of an idea and was further shaped by team member suggestions. Initial pitch involvement isn't a status marker, roles evolve with project needs.
The fact that we were critical of the studio taking this new direction, or rather the quality of this direction, meant that we were told after a few of these meetings that they bought us flights to go back home. Then they said, you need to meet with Kaur, you're going to meet with management, and they're going to have a talking with you. In
the immediate aftermath, while we were waiting for Kaur to, I think he had COVID or something, Dora was put on a mobile game, and I was supposed to work on a board game. Coming from, I often say that back then, after Disco Elysium's success, being a member of the Zaum writing team was like a badge of honor, like being a UFC fighter. Like it really meant something. And from that to go to a mobile game and board game, it was humiliating, really humiliating.
So what does Zaum have to say about this moment? After publicly calling the project shit, Argo and Dora both refused to keep working on it when asked, hence they were not removed. Following a productive conversation, they started conceptualizing DLC for Disco Elysium, X7. In hindsight, they were rewarded for their insubordination, and we have learned from this saga.
When we were canned from Project C4, there was no sort of like due procedure or like goodbye messages or something like that. Next day you're out of the Slack channel, and then there was just absolutely no communication. And also to keep in mind that this is an era of remote work. Like Dora and I, we were living in Brighton. I don't think, like, it might have been like that literally like a month went by and we only communicated with a producer.
This complaint of feeling isolated from the rest of Zaum, of being cut off from other co-workers on other projects, it's also a complaint you may remember Robert, Rostov and Helen made as well.
And then I go and just type right in Slack to Kaur, ask like, hey, what's happening? have we had like a misunderstanding? How come I'm only now hearing about the release date?
Now, Argo and Dora both argue that this was Zaum working exactly as intended, that the company's management sought to hold on to its own absolute control at the expense of interpersonal relationships and company culture. But even those I've spoken to within the company who don't agree with that assessment, who don't see the kind of malicious intent that Argo and Dora might, even they agree that this siloing of different projects and teams within Zaum has been a major problem ever since the company first expanded outside of Estonia. Eventually, Argo and Dora took a new pitch to Zaum's leadership. What if they could find a way to return to Disco Elysium without the studio needing to make a full-blown sequel? Instead, they could zoom in on one of Argo's own characters from that world, Kuno, and in doing so, perhaps earn the right from fans to return to Elysium despite everything that had happened. This project was initially codenamed X7, but would later be known as Locust City: An Elysium Story.
At that time at Zaum, there was the attitude that you should be able to just come up with the next, multi-million-dollar project just in a week or something, and again, no pre-production or anything. Like, yeah, you guys just come up with something. And for us, it was a kind of a bargain with the devil a little bit, because it was we really we enjoyed making games, and we liked what was working on the sequel was really good. So we thought. If we could get there again, if we could do that would be so much better than working on something else. So we thought that's the best we're going to get. We weren't allowed. We asked them, can we pitch a project that is not Elysium? Can we do something else? The answer was no. So in a way, once we did manage to fight for and get this opportunity to make something like this that would have been quite unique and stood on its own, we thought it would be kind of a good way to hold the fort until whatever happens with the larger IP and the sequel will be decided.
When we did that pitch, they were very excited. The reaction on every step of the way was extremely positive. And also when we came up with the pitch, for ourselves we set certain parameters. Like for me, it was very important that we don't step on Robert stuff. That's why we chose the character that I made before we were even a video game studio existed. Dora, you came up. I can't talk about the mechanics too much.
Maybe it's worth me quickly stepping in here to clarify why Argo and Dora are avoiding any direct discussion of the design of Locust City in this interview. In fact, they don't even use that name, they stick to saying X7 instead. This is because the pair are still beholden to the contracts they both signed while working at Zaum. And when it comes to contract disputes, as you'll hear later on, they've already got one. However, given an internal presentation of the game was leaked online back in April, I can flesh out a few details here myself, although we're unable to show any of the leaked footage. As I mentioned earlier, Locust City would have featured both Kuno and Kuno S as protagonists, with the player being able to switch between them at will while exploring the world or even mid-dialogue. Both kids would have had their own personality, stats, items, and thoughts they could contribute to a dual thought cabinet, with the idea being that Kuno and Kuno S would experience the world differently, influencing each other's perspectives, but also potentially clashing with one another as well. The leaked presentation even suggested one particularly bleak outcome in which one of these kids may end up killing the other. The game would have opened with the murder of Kuno's father, so death and the idea of taking a life were both key themes being explored here. One other mechanic which I think sounded really exciting was an item which Kuno would carry with him throughout the game. It was called Locust City, and it was a cardboard box with some holes in the lid. Kuno could peer through these holes and observe an entire civilization of locusts building itself up brick by brick. Kuno's thoughts and feelings about what he's experiencing in his world would then have a direct influence on what he sees in this box. The locusts would develop their own political ideology, culture, architecture based on Kuno's own psyche. He'd also be able to drop physical items into Locust City in order to further shape the world as they become buildings, landmarks, or advanced technology in turn. Of course, it's very, very easy to let your imagination run wild with cancelled projects when they're all promise and yet to be weighed down by the reality of being fully developed. But some of this stuff, to me, sounded incredible.
The project was around 8 months of work had been put into it by the time that you started interviewing us and all the other workers. It seemed like at that point there had already been so much momentum. Work that was being done was so good, the reactions inside the company were so good, people were really happy to see it. We were really happy to work on it. It was just, I think we got really attached to the beauty of the idea and how well it worked. And funnily enough, I had spoken to Johan Rostov's wife a few times early on, and she had said, you guys are delusional. Like you can do good work elsewhere, and it doesn't matter that your idea is good. The management are, they're going to crunch you out. They're going to make it impossible to finish. They're going to screw it up. And I remember at that time thinking, like, I don't know, I didn't believe it.
Given it was at this point in time that I first interviewed Argo, when the optimism surrounding Locust City was perhaps at its highest, that does go some way to explaining why his feelings towards Zaum back then were mostly positive. But I do need to say here that this missing context we're now hearing from him and Dora, the clashes over Project C4, then being kicked off that game entirely and ending up on mobile and board game teams instead, feeling discarded and unwanted, the alleged mismanagement by Zaum's leadership when it comes to things like pre-production and deadlines, all of this stuff, it's just not in that original interview. Now, I can understand why Argo may not have mentioned all of this when I last spoke to him, because, I mean, he was employed at Zaum at the time, and I'm not sure his employers would have been thrilled. But this interview does change how I feel about that first one. The united front of Zaum employees I was being told about at the time by him and others, well, if what Argo and Dora are now saying is true, it clearly had some major cracks in it, even then. With Project C4 being the studio's priority, the team on Locust City remained lean to begin with. For the first 6 months or so, only about half a dozen people worked on this game, although I'm told there were some question marks around the hierarchy on that team. Despite Argo and Dora having pitched the concept, neither of them were given the lead writer or game director roles.
We did get a pay increase that would have corresponded with our leadership role, or at least like.
No, I did not.
Okay,
I was making, I think, 3 times less than some male directors in the company. So.
Well, I didn't make. Well, I made a little bit more than you, but I didn't make a director's wage either.
From the moment when they came and told us pitch a whole new project that we're going to invest millions in, this was already well outside our job description. It was now directing. Now you need to come up with a whole direction for various disciplines. Initially, we didn't even ask for it because we just felt that the titles wouldn't matter, and also like we didn't want to rock the boat too much, and we were just happy to work. But then after a while, it became clear that they did not want us in the same in the same positions that the other people were.
I asked Zaum why the pair hadn't been offered leadership roles on X7, to which the studio responded, idea generation or final creative sign-off isn't the same as leading a multidisciplinary team. Games are an orchestra, not a solo, and leadership here serves the whole team, not a lone auteur. At no time during their respective tenures did either exhibit any of the expected skills and traits of either being a manager or leader on the X7 team. Thus, these roles were not offered to either of them. While Argo was not the game director, which he expressly said he did not want multiple times, he did have final approval over the game's narrative and writing. Now, that final line about Argo not wanting to be game director, I think there's some context worth explaining here. As tensions surrounding this question of leadership on the Locust City project began to bubble up more and more, a series of meetings were arranged over June and July of 2024 in which the team structure was to be discussed. And in one of the earlier meetings, I understand that Argo in particular felt unsure about taking on this game director role because it had been explained to him by Zaum's leadership at the time that this would likely mean he wouldn't have much time to contribute as a writer on the project as well. However, by the end of this process, his stance seems to have shifted, and he communicated that although he didn't want to take on a lead role, he felt obligated in this case to do so because of his own relationship with the Elysian world. This issue came to a head several times across the development of Locust City, but things really soured in the months just after our first documentary when another of the studio's projects, called P1, that's the code name, it's also known as Pioneer, was cancelled. Side note, you may have already recognized that name, Pioneer, as the same intellectual property that Ilmar Kompas bought and then resold to Zaum in order to become the company's major shareholder. Pioneer was, for a time, in development at the studio, with very early plans describing it as a massive sci-fi experience that would look to rival the likes of CD Projekt's Cyberpunk 2077.
P1 was supposed to be, I mean, this was completely insane, but their early idea was they were going to be a GTA scale project.
200-hour open world.
Yeah, like hundreds of people. Of course, it got cancelled way before it got to that stage, but it was this huge sinking ship, and you had X7, which was a very small raft. Like, this is a very small, quick team that's making this standalone thing, and it's built around this very tight vision of the few people left who really understood the Elysium setting and the Elysium vision. And now, if we're going to start taking all the people from the sinking ship, then they're going to sink the raft.
In June 2023, as this transition was underway, Zaum's executive producer, Thomas Harvel, told the pair during a call that he didn't believe they had the correct skill set to lead this project going forward, saying, and I quote, "Inexperienced leads should not lead." Thonis explained that he was very unhappy with the way in which Argo and Dora had voiced their concerns about the project in front of other employees at the company, and he advised them to think about how this may be affecting team morale. As a way of demonstrating this, he asked Argo how he felt the Pioneer writers would react if they knew what Argo had said in a previous meeting where it was first suggested that they would be joining the Locust City team. Thonis then asked one of Zaum's lead producers, Phil Davidson, to repeat what Argo had said to him during an argument in which Phil had just suggested that Locust City had two options. It either needed to take on these new writers or face cancellation. It would turn out that Phil hadn't had the right to necessarily say that, but as I said, it was an argument, things were heated. Following Thonis' request in this new call, Phil then repeats what Argo had said during the argument, and here's how that went, word for word. "You said we would rather not make the project than make a turd. You said if the P1 writers join, it'd be a turd, and you would rather not make a project than make a turd." What made this particular moment so explosive, in which Argo's words are repeated in this way, is that there was another person in the call hearing this for the first time. Jim Asher-Levy, the newly appointed narrative team lead for Locust City. Jim had just been made Argo and Dora's direct superior on the project, but prior to that, he'd been the one leading the writing on Pioneer. It's hard to fully get across how uncomfortable a moment this was, but the meeting would later be described in internal emails as having been catastrophic for the team dynamic. One current Zaum employee, when I asked them about it, referred to this moment as Turdgate. Argo and Dora were furious, accusing Thonis of needlessly pouring gasoline over their working relationship with their new lead. Argo argued that his comment had been taken out of context, that he wasn't criticizing the writers' talents as individuals, but rather the way in which this process was being handled, and that he'd also said those words in confidence to a producer, not expecting they would then be repeated in such a humiliating way. By the end of the year, Jim had resigned from his position on the Locust City team, citing Argo and Dora as his reason for doing so. We did specifically ask Thonis Harvel if he'd like to comment on this meeting, but instead we received a written response from Zaum as a studio, which said, "Argo has a track record of describing every project he is not personally involved in as excrement, both inside and outside the studio. This type of behavior is not consistent with our values, and he never appreciated it when it was addressed." I will say that we had specifically asked about Thonis' involvement in this call as well, although as you've just seen from the reply I've read, that's not something the studio commented on. In the aftermath of this meeting, things did not improve.
And I tried to explain to them that, yeah, but like the integrity of this Elysium IP, that it is not just like a random game. If we had decided to make a new thing from the beginning, I can be just a rank and file rider in the back of the line, but I can't watch you kind of flush it down the toilet, because these decisions that were made without supervision, left and right, were just like god awful. Like Kolasmaa being one of them. So I felt very much this responsibility for the Elysium IP.
That September, after a trip home to Estonia, Argo returned with a drastic proposal for Zaum's leadership, which he pitched as the only way to get this game's development back on track.
The gist of this proposal was something that I stand by to this day. I think it was the right thing to do. I think it would have saved X7, and I think in a way it would have, by extension, saved the company. Was to downsize the entire project into this small, agile spike team, we call it. The idea there was that if we get the script, even like a first draft of it was actually first draft, not like a finished version, in 6 months, first draft of the entire script of the game, then from there on it is so much easier to do this actual polishing. Like at that point, Embarrassed to say, but I had given up this hope that we can do the same amount of rewrites or this same amount of quality even as we did with Disco, but it still seemed that we might be able to pull it off at an acceptable level if we break ourselves on the wheel.
Having seen this proposal myself, I'd say there are two specific recommendations that will have shocked Zaum's management the most. The first is in relation to that downsizing that Argo just mentioned. In his proposal, he lists 22 people working on Locust City, many of whom had previously been a part of the Pioneer team, whose roles would now be redundant. He goes on to suggest that where possible, these employees should be switched to other projects within Zaum, but where this isn't a feasible option, he would personally take responsibility for letting them go. And then he also suggested that both Robert Kurvitz and Alexander Rostov should both be approached about consulting on the development of Locust City.
I felt that more than anything, this company had lost this, how do I put it, this Renaissance ambitions, like this kind of like art first approach. Like everything started feeling more and more like a product. We're making a product. It was only logical that at some point, if you want to turn this Zaum disaster around, you have to forge peace. Like it was clearly a very, very bad decision. Like at this point, who doubts that it was a bad decision to oust Rostov and Robert? Like what has gone better since then?
Argo tells me that this was an idea he hadn't even ran by Robert and Rostov at the time. And in fact, Argo and Robert haven't spoken since well before our last documentary even aired, back when the Zaum fallout first began. According to Argo, during that last conversation, Robert had told him that if the two were to ever speak again, Argo would need to, and I quote, crawl back and apologize on his knees. Zaum's leadership, meanwhile, were extremely concerned with this proposal, with the company's president, Ed Tomaszewski, writing the following in an email to Argo. This is going to read overly dramatic. The way that you react to this feedback is going to set the tone for the rest of your career. You might not believe it, but I genuinely care about your future, both here and beyond. I don't believe you fully understand the ramifications of this proposal, even just the mere existence of it. If this proposal was discussed or shown to more members of the team, it would cause an uproar that would rival prior members' departures. You would be vilified by other team members, whether you put them on your redundancy list or not. I can't imagine that a significant number of people here would now want to work with you. Would you work with someone who would advocate for firing most of the team after coming back from vacation? If this proposal was made public, it would give the community and our fans the impression that we are so creatively desperate that we cannot survive without our former team members who are still in active litigation, Robert and Rostov. I hope one day we are on neutral or even good terms with them, but that day is not today. Argo's reply to this email at the time does go on to thank Ed for, and I quote, expressing that care about my future, which sounds more sarcastic when I read it out loud. I don't think that was the intention. Anyway, here's how Zaum describes receiving Argo's proposal today. After months of seemingly good faith work on X7's narrative team structure, Argo holding final writing approval, Argo confirming he did not want to be game director, and both Argo and Dora approving team roles, we received a proposal to replace that structure. We rejected it. We empower teams, not individuals. Success is shared, not vested in one person. The proposal was firmly rejected, and then over the next few months, a lot of different things happened all at once. In mid-November, Dora informed the company that she'd be submitting a formal complaint, detailing in writing the ways in which she felt she'd been mistreated at the company, with a particular focus on what she described as the bullying behavior of Thomas Harvel and other senior staff.
Morale was awful, and at that point, Argo and I had also started talking to our union, the Writers Guild of Great Britain, where we told them, look, we have all of these circumstances at work, and we're quite sure that management is going to try to either sever us from our work or cut everything. And that was when they had explained to us what we can do if we feel we're being mistreated at work, which was to lodge these grievances, these complaints.
This complaint referred to some of the issues you've already heard about, like, for example, Turdgate, or the confusion surrounding Dora's role on X7, or her allegation that she was being underpaid when compared to her male colleagues. Dora also claimed to have felt discriminated against as a result of her gender, stating that her feedback or criticism was more likely to be reacted to negatively when compared to similar points being raised by male colleagues, or that she was more likely to be interrupted, dismissed, or chastised by Zaum's leadership, all of whom were male. A few days after letting the company know that a complaint was coming, but before it was actually sent, Argo and Dora found out that an investigation had been launched into their own behaviour at the company, with their former narrative lead, Jim Asher-Levy, accusing them of having created a toxic work environment on that team. Now, both Argo and Dora claim that these allegations were unfounded and that the only tension they were aware of between themselves and Jim came from that call that we described earlier, in which Argo's words had been repeated at the behest of Thomas Harvel. However, following interviews with several of their colleagues, an investigation carried out by an external HR consultant did conclude that their behaviour had been enough of a problem to justify disciplinary hearings. Although no Zaum employees have gone on camera for this second documentary, here's what I understand to have been some of the issues raised about their behaviour at the time. As you can likely tell by some of the interviews they've done, both Argo and Dora have a pretty direct way of communicating, especially when they're discussing creative work they take issue with. For some, this was a refreshing trait of theirs. For others, it was not. Some colleagues spoke about what they saw as Argo and Dora's recurring issues with authority figures within the company, or just a general lack of trust towards other co-workers at Zaum. When it came to conversations like those we've already mentioned relating to team structure and hierarchy on Act 7, I understand some employees felt these discussions were made more challenging because Argo and Dora were in a relationship together, and that this dynamic was sometimes difficult to navigate. And finally, both Argo and Dora, but especially Argo, took the stewardship of Disco Elysium very seriously. This pressure, some have suggested, compounded all of those other problems we've just described and led to the escalation of what could have otherwise been smaller problems within the studio. Zaum itself declined to comment on this investigation or why the disciplinary hearings that it had suggested did not then take place. As for Dora's complaint, this too was investigated by an external HR consultant who concluded that her grievances could not be substantiated. Dora would go on to appeal this decision on the grounds that, amongst other things, the investigation had only interviewed one other woman out of a total of 11 interviews. I asked them about this investigation and they provided the following response. When Dora raised concerns to peers, HR encouraged her to file a formal grievance so it could be fully examined. We followed and exceeded our policies and the law. In the end though, things were about to resolve themselves in a very different way. In February 2024, X7 or Locust City was officially cancelled by Zaum, with the company's president telling employees that the game had initially been imagined as a much smaller project, aiming for a 2023 release, but over the course of its development, it had ballooned into something that would require more time and resources than even Disco Elysium itself. And so Zaum had now decided to cancel the game, and this decision would almost certainly lead to redundancies. There was, of course, no almost about it. Nearly a third of Zaum's employees lost their jobs as a result of this cancellation, with Argo and Dora amongst them. But for them, well, things did play out in their own unique way. They weren't pushed out of the company as much as they jumped. And in doing so, mid-jump, well, they threw a hand grenade over their shoulder as well. Before any final list of redundancies had been drawn up internally, Argo and Dora gave the most explosive interview to the press, in which they described the company as being like a fish rotting from the head. "It's the people on top," said Argo, "the motherfuckers in sailing shoes and bow ties that fucked Harry, fucked Kim, fucked Robert, Rostov, Helen, Olga, Cash, fucked Elysium, fucked you, and me too. They are not artists, they are professional fuckers." The pair were immediately suspended from Zaum in the aftermath of this interview and informed that a disciplinary hearing would now need to take place, with the assumption being that there was a very high chance they were about to be fired for gross misconduct. Before that could happen, Argo and Dora both decided to resign.
At that point, we just felt just tired of playing by these rules when they're not playing by the rules, and it was extremely liberating.
So here's the multi-million-dollar question. Why does this stuff keep happening at Zaum? From Argo and Dora's perspective, what is it about this company that has now led to two different groups of Disco Elysium talent being jettisoned out of the company amidst such massive scandal? In the full interview, Thomas Harvel receives a fair share of the blame here, as you might expect, with Dora even going as far as comparing the company structure and culture to that of a cult. But here's what Argo left me with as I asked him to reflect on this Zaum chapter of his life that is now well and truly closed.
I would reframe this question like why did it fell apart into how did it stay together in the first place, like, because I often contemplated that the miracle of Disco Elysium is that three such extreme personalities like Robert, Kaur and Tõnis were able to tolerate each other enough over the course of 5 years. Disco Elysium got made. And the question there for me has been like, like what was it that made it? What was the drive there that made them all suffer or bear this? And I think the answer to this is need, because there was nothing left in Estonia for them. Tõnis had been convicted in a financial crime, like had to evacuate Estonia. Kaur had just been vindicated by the court for writing the allegedly writing the untitled, well, probably not actually writing it. And Robert had kind of failed to achieve mainstream success with his book, with his music. So like this mentality of burning the boats, like leaving everything aside, giving it this one really dedicated shot in the UK, and where success is the only way. We either succeed or we perish to a degree where we can't even predict what's going to happen. I think this is what forced these people to stay together.
Zaum's official response, as you may well imagine, takes a different view. The departure of previous team members could have been handled better, and we learned a lot from that incident and implemented several changes. In contrast, Argo and Dora's resignations were preceded by a project cancellation and standard, thoroughly documented HR procedures. We do not see parallels between their departures and those of others. To date, no Zaum team members have voluntarily left Zaum to join those former colleagues. Okay, let's take a quick breather here before we delve into our final chapter. Journalism is an imperfect craft. It's a process that can involve the synthesization of an enormous amount of information and different points of view into something that you hope feels coherent and interesting, and most of all, fair. In that last section, we've tried to understand what it is about Zaum that has led to such chaos unfolding in the wake of Disco Elysium's incredible success. And I think Argo and Dora's perspective on that question is a vital one. But I'm also aware that if you were to ask 25 different people who've worked at this company over the years those same sorts of questions, you're going to end up with more than one answer. Over the course of this documentary and the last, we've tried to add some flesh to the bones of this Zaum conundrum. We've of course heard accusations that this company has been illegally seized by financial criminals, and we're still waiting to see if that's something that can be proven in court. Others have talked about the ways in which Zaum was forever changed by its success and the money that came flooding in with it. Some talk about the siloing of different creatives and teams, a problem which was then exacerbated by the pandemic and remote work. There are those that blame the egos of management or of different writers, or the simple fact that Zaum started off as this punk Estonian art collective and then somehow transitioned into a 100-person company, forever changing its identity in the process. Now, I don't know if we're going to return to Disco Elysium on PMG in the future, or to this question as to what went wrong at Zaum, and so I feel an additional responsibility here to try and end on the right note. Once again, I found myself having sympathy for the people still working at this company, those who joined because they loved Disco Elysium and just wanted to be a part of whatever followed it. I can only imagine how draining it must be to pour your heart into, for example, Project C4, knowing that even if you're able to contribute the very best work of your career, that toil is, for many people, only ever going to be viewed through the lens of what they see as Zaum's cardinal sin. At the same time, I do also think Argo's departure from Zaum is a turning point. He was the last remaining link to that original world of Elysium, the one first conjured up by a ragtag group of anarchists that once called themselves the Overcoats, and that link has now well and truly been severed. There are of course still people left at the studio who have every right to say they helped make Disco Elysium, but there's something increasingly uncomfortable about even the name Zaum, first coined for this cultural collective that no longer even exists, now being the property of a corporate body instead. A company that has evolved into something else entirely while still using a logo first modelled after some bird shit, or maybe paint, the stories differ, on Robert Kurvitz's apartment window in Tallinn, Estonia. I've been reminded while working on this follow-up that there are still folks at Zaum who wear the official Disco Elysium merch to the office, who decorate their walls in their apartments with Disco Elysium artwork. This game is a part of their identity, and yet Disco Elysium 2 is not being made by them or by anybody else either. Zaum may have the rights to do so, but they no longer have any of the original writers, and even if they were able to create a sequel, many fans would hate and condemn it. While on the other hand, Robert Kurvitz, Alexander Rostov, Helen Himper, and now Argo Tulik, they can't make that game either. I mean, they can and hopefully will go on to create other things, and perhaps in those endeavors, they'll be able to recapture some of the feeling of that original work. But as it stands, they too can't create the sequel to the game that changed all of their lives. It all feels like such a colossal waste. That is, unless, I suppose, you're one of the law firms representing any one of these parties, honestly, because there, maybe, is the true unspoken prize at the heart of this dispute: the billable hour. Speaking of which, before we get started on this final chapter, it's perhaps worth mentioning that People Make Games has also needed to rack up its own somewhat costly legal fees as well. In order to publish this documentary, but especially the section you're about to watch, we've needed to contract a media lawyer to help us navigate exactly how we can share this story with you. And so if there are moments coming up in which you find yourself thinking, the way in which Chris described that interaction, or the way in which something was shown on screen feels quite particular, well, you can imagine there may have been a good reason for that. To be entirely honest with you, it's been an expensive process. Our lawyer is a specialist in this field. She's very, very good. She also charges hundreds of pounds per hour. That's before you think about things like media insurance that we need to have in place to have the confidence to publish this documentary, and then weather any legal threats that may come on the other side of that. For a small outfit like us, it's no joke. So on that note, if you're a People Make Games patron, please understand that you are the reason we're able to publish stories like this one and feel as safe as we can in doing so. We may not be part of some larger media organization with the protections that could afford us, but your support has meant we don't need to be. We're still able to do the kind of reporting we think we should be doing, and I'm just extremely grateful for that. And hey, if you're not a patron, take a look at the runtime below this video and just imagine how many billable hours we're now on the hook for after the last couple of months. Just saying. Okay, with that, let's go back to the story. So, as we covered earlier, after Zaum, Argo and Dora ended up very briefly at Darkmath Games, where things didn't work out and they parted way due to creative differences. And you'll remember we talked about a meeting in which Kaukenda, the founder of the studio, allegedly shared pictures of his ex-wife, right? Well, that is part of the story, but it's not the entire thing. In fact, Argo and Dora were fired. So that writers' meeting with the pictures is meant to have taken place in July of last year as part of a larger company trip to a villa on the Spanish coast. Also on that trip was one of Darkmath's more recent investors, a South African tech entrepreneur called Riaz Muller, who'd been invited alongside some of the other investors in the company in order for the studio to give them an update on what was happening and to drum up further investment. Now, this investor meeting also didn't really go to plan.
Kaur had made promises that soon we're gonna make a Steam page, we're gonna make an announcement, we're gonna make a playable, but
Pre-orders were gonna start any moment.
We didn't even have a main character, or couldn't fully even agree on the genre of the game. So we said we strongly veto any attempt to use our names to promote something that is kind of deceiving the fans, that's like a fake screenshot or something of the sort. And that's where it got really tense, because then the investors started questioning Kaur, okay, but what is the state of the project currently? And then Riaz started asking, what is your runway? Is it 6 months? Is it 12 months? And suddenly, Kaur and management, they didn't want to answer this question. And this is the tension where the meeting was called off.
Again, Darkmath has declined to comment on this meeting. Riaz left the very next day, and while traveling would go on to send an 8,000-word email to both Argo and Dora detailing his concerns about the future of Darkmath Games. 8,000 words is enormous, by the way. There are research papers that don't reach that sort of word count. In this email, Riaz claimed that Darkmath's finances were in such a state that it may only have about a month's worth of expenses left in the bank, caused in part by the significant salaries being taken out by each of the company's 4 founders. I'm extremely concerned that the company will likely not release a game, wrote Riaz, and I have potentially been misled by Kaur and Mikhail, referring to Darkmath CEO Mikhail Ozja. Outside of his worries about Darkmath, Riaz also used this email to pitch himself to Argo and Dora, describing his history as an entrepreneur and also how Disco Elysium was, and I quote, a top 10 game for me. I wouldn't say the best though, which unintentionally I think is a very funny sentence to have included. He mentioned that he'd seen the People Make Games documentary, although only watched some of it. I mean, you and several 100,000 other people, honestly, Riaz, that's on me, it's too long. Later, he describes Robert Kurvitz as not Rostov, the other guy. And finally, when pitching the idea of a new studio to Argo and Dora, he suggests that they may want to consider using generative AI to handle the character voices in the game in order to cut down on costs without sacrificing creative direction. Now, I mention these points not to make fun of the email, but to highlight the fact that Argo Andorra and Riaz Müller come from very different worlds. They have totally different touch points, and I think that may go some way to explain why this relationship ends as terribly as you're about to hear. Anyway, the email concludes with Riaz Müller putting forwards 3 different options for the pair to consider, given what he's just told them about the potential trouble that Darkmath Games may have found itself in. Option 1, the 3 of them confront Darkmath's original founders and force the company to change. Option 2, if things don't then improve, the 3 of them should leave Darkmath and Riaz would set up a new company to make a new video game with Argo Andorra. Interestingly, given what's about to happen, Riaz included some suggestions with this option for how Argo Andorra may be able to navigate around any non-compete clauses that are currently in their Darkmath contracts. And finally, option 3, they all leave Darkmath but do their own thing instead. Under another section in this email titled Suggested Strategy, Riaz encourages Argo Andorra to take the concerns that he's just raised directly to Darkmath CEO Mikhail Ozha, and then eventually even to Kawakenda himself.
We were given, I think, like 1% of the company just as employees for accepting the job, and he said, you know, every one of us, because we are shareholders, we could be responsible in some way legally, so this is a really dangerous situation, guys. And so he kind of passed the task on to Argo to confront management about this.
When asked to comment on the existence of this 8,000-word email, Riaz initially claimed more than once that he was unaware that any such communication had actually happened. When I later clarified that he'd shared this email with Argo Andorra as part of a Google Doc titled 10th of July 2024 Riaz email, and I found it unlikely that he'd forgotten about such a significant piece of correspondence, he was then able to recall it. In the end, Riaz sent over the following statement from Longdew Games. None of Longdew's team have anything to do with Argo Andorra's firing from Darkmath. It is clear that they independently departed from 3 video game studios on bad terms in a short period of time and should take responsibility for this. Argo claims to have taken these allegations that very same day to both Mikhail and Kawa, demanding answers from the pair of them. And according to Argo, in this conversation, Kawakenda fired both him and Dora on the spot. Now, we did reach out to Darkmath Games about this allegation, but the studio has declined to comment. We have, however, seen an email dated July 16th, 2024, which appears to show Argo Tulik contacting the Darkmath CEO, Mikhail Ozha, in the direct aftermath of these firings. In this email, Argo reiterates the points that he says he just raised in that previous discussion. This includes references to many of the allegations that have been laid out in Riaz Müller's email, although his name isn't mentioned anywhere here, as well as a complaint regarding Kawa's decision to share explicit photos of his ex-wife in a company meeting. Another line reads, "I voiced my concern that the main purpose of the company is to attract more investors, to pay high above industry average salaries to founders/first investors instead of actually making a game." Darkmath once again declined to comment on either the existence of this email or why Argo Andorra were fired to begin with. Riaz has since remained an investor in the company and would even go on to increase his stake in Darkmath at a later point, whereas Argo Andorra say they were left out of pocket to the tune of about £14,000 in unpaid wages, which would eventually be settled some 3 months later. In the weeks that followed, Riaz remained in regular contact with the pair, advising them on their legal standing with Darkmath and how they may want to go about pressuring the company to get a hold of that missing pay. One voice note we've heard sent by Riaz to Argo Andorra around this time suggested that he could lend them some money to help with rent while they figure out how to get what they're owed from Darkmath. On that note, he adds, "In terms of lawyer, look, I don't want to be arrogant, but I'm pretty good. I've been to court a lot."
For the second time in a year, we're in a situation where, well, we don't have any more money, we don't know how to pay rent. And so Riaz said, well, you know, while we're figuring out this Darkmath thing and thinking about the future, I can give you a consultancy at my edutech business. It's a very legitimate, you know, all above board.
Another voice note sent in mid-July included a suggestion from Riaz that Argo Andorra may be able to do some consulting for his company, Hyperion Dev. He explained the work would involve creating an online course on how to develop a video game as part of an upcoming partnership between Hyperion and a major games publisher. Hyperion is the name of a tech education company majority owned by Riaz Müller, which based on a recent crowdfunding campaign is currently valued somewhere in the region of £180 million. The company sells training courses or boot camps in software engineering and other similar fields, boasting partnerships with several major UK universities. Although parts of its business operate under the name Hyperion, it is registered in the UK under a different name, Code Grammar Limited. And on the 21st of July, both Argo and Dora received job offers from this company stating the following. This letter confirms an offer to consult for Cogrammer Limited in the capacity of a research and development game developer on a consultancy agreement for an indefinite period. And it's here where things start to get complicated. Argo and Dora argue that this specific language used here, research and development, game developer, didn't match the pitch that Riaz had first given them.
We really got red flags from these wires being crossed. So early in August, we were trying to really hard to get a meeting with him, which we finally managed to have, I think, 1 week, 8th of August or something like that.
Now, the pair didn't sign the contracts to begin with, stating they felt uncomfortable with some of the wording being used. There was one clause, for example, that said any intellectual property the pair created while at Cogrammer would belong to Cogrammer. Now, that's fairly standard boilerplate language in a lot of employment contracts, but Argo and Dora argue that this was not a typical employment situation. They say this consultancy work was just meant to keep things ticking over, to help them pay rent while they developed a new video game pitch and while Riaz Müller came up with the foundations for a new studio, and only if both of those things felt compatible would they move forward together. And so, according to Argo and Dora, there was a problem. They say they didn't want to sign over the rights to this new pitch they were creating right away because at this point they could still go their separate ways. But as you've already heard, there was another clause that in the end would prove much more contentious. A clause that remained in those contracts when the dotted lines were signed. And it's this one that states that Argo and Dora wouldn't be able to do any work in the same area of business as the work they'd be involved with at Cogrammer for a period of at least 6 months following their departure from the company.
At that point, it was already halfway through August and our last salary had been in June because Dark Math hadn't paid us. So our rent is due in a week or two, and we could notice that Riaz is also stalling with this kind of stuff to put us in a situation where we might just have to sign it. And before that, of course, we had always gotten lawyers from the Writers Guild, from the union, to vet all our contracts. As life goes, this one time when we're like, look, we don't have time to wait 2 weeks for the lawyers to vet this, we need to sign now. But look, since it's a completely different field from games, then maybe there's not the real harm to us, because how is he going to go after us in the games industry if he's working in the tech industry? It's like a completely different field.
Given these contracts are at the very heart of this case, here's what Longdew Games had to say about why the signing of these documents is so crucially important. Having worked on Disco Elysium does not give someone the right to breach contracts, steal intellectual property, misuse confidential information, or spread lies. An independent judge has already issued a restraining order against Argo and Dora and ruled that there is sufficient evidence that they breached their contracts with Longdew, due to the contract stating that they should not launch a competing video game venture within 6 months from the date they left Longdew. Now, I think I need to interrupt this comment here to quickly point out that using the name Longdew in this context is a little misleading. Argo and Dora, as we've described earlier, were not employed by the video games company Longdew Games. They were instead employed by Cogrammer Limited. In fact, Longdew Games Limited wasn't even registered as a company until the 14th of November 2024, nearly 2 months after Argo and Dora had resigned. There was another company registered before this point called Longdew Limited, which is partly owned by Cogrammer, with the rest being owned by Riaz, although even this company was not registered until 2 days after Dora and Argo had sent in their resignation letters. And so, just to be crystal clear, there are no contracts that have been signed between Argo and Dora and Longdew Games. Instead, what's been referred to here, I believe, is the contracts that were signed with Cogrammer Limited. Contracts that, if this case does make its way to court, will then need to be looked at by a judge who will need to deem whether or not those contracts have actually been breached. Speaking of which, this comment also refers to a judge having already ruled against Argo and Dora, and to clarify, that's the initial injunction hearing being described, which is not the same as the full hearing that may eventually happen if the case does ultimately get ruled on. So in reality, what work did the two of them actually do for Cogrammer? Well, in terms of the bootcamp, it sounds like not much.
It didn't seem to be a problem. And when you're asking specifically about the work we did for Cogrammer and consulting, it was incredibly basic.
There was, however, this other work happening simultaneously in which Argo and Dora were starting to think about the next game they may develop and whether or not they wanted to do that as part of a new company with Riaz Müller as the major investor. There was friction over how much of this new company Argo and Dora could expect to own. Figures like 5%, 10%, 15% were bandied about, but as I understand it, Riaz felt these numbers were far too high. Interestingly, in that same meeting, Riaz suggested that Argo hand over his remaining shares in Dark Math Games as a way of addressing the poor value that Riaz had received from his initial investment there. Let me just give a very quick breakdown of what that request would have actually meant. Riaz had previously made a fairly significant investment into Dark Math Games in exchange for 10 shares in the company, while Argo at the time had 40 shares, which he'd been given as an incentive for taking the job to begin with. It's actually a bit more complicated than that. Argo wasn't meant to receive so many shares in the company right away. This was meant to have been staggered across the development of XXX Night Shift, but the company made a mistake and ended up giving him a bunch up front. He would later return those shares, but at this point he still had 40. And so, to contextualize the request that Riaz had made here, if we were to value Argo shares using the same pricing that Riaz had paid for his own investment, we're talking about a significant six-figure fortune. Now, with that being said, both Argo and Riaz in this meeting seemed to recognize that that was unlikely to be a realistic valuation given the progress that Dark Math had made so far, but still, quite a request. Longzhu provided the following statement when asked about this proposed transaction. Argo was accidentally issued additional shares in Dark Math Games, which he offered to sell to various people, including Longzhu team members, after signing his contract with Longzhu. Again, small note, Argo hadn't signed a contract with Longzhu Games, he'd signed one with Cogrammer Limited. And on this note of whose idea it was to make this transaction of the shares, People Games has seen the minutes from this particular meeting, which very clearly seem to state that it was Riaz who had proposed the idea. In fact, Argo replies to that particular proposal in the comments on that document, saying, "If you're sincerely interested in the DMG shares, then we can have a separate discussion on that. I'm not opposed to selling, but I also don't want to turn founding a new studio and wrapping up Dark Math business into one thing." Argo declined the offer and Riaz eventually dropped the subject, but issues over ownership and creative control, they persisted.
Because we came into this idea with this perception that it's going to be equal. Like, we want to be the creative decision makers, you can be a silent investor, but it's definitely not going to be that you are the majority investor who is going to be involved in everything. Because it very quickly, in the first few days, became evident that Riaz is the ultimate micromanager. Like, he wants to be part of every little process, like sign off on every little thing. We knew from the beginning that if we're going to do something together, we need to be guarded against that.
Over the next few weeks, as Argo and Dora were working on this new video game pitch, they say that Riaz had become increasingly difficult to contact. In fact, they claim to have tried to arrange a meeting about this new studio repeatedly and unsuccessfully over a period of 4 weeks. On the 23rd of September, both Argo and Dora handed in their resignations, with Dora writing the following in an email to Riaz. "This Friday will be a full month that you have been planning and postponing the conversation about the future of our project. It does not seem to be moving forward, as 1 month is enough time to find a slot to discuss these, for us, very important things. Unfortunately, we feel this will not change, so we're offering our resignation letters in attachment and our 1 week notice." Their last day at Cogrammer was the 30th of September, meaning that in total, they were employed there for just under 7.5 weeks. During a final video call a few days earlier, things seemed to have ended on reasonably good terms. Riaz was going to carry on and launch a new video game studio without them. This would eventually be Longzhu Games, and the three of them discussed advice and hiring suggestions for their new projects. In fact, at the end of the call, Riaz even goes as far as offering them both shares in this new company as a gesture for the work and the contributions they've made. So what on earth happened? I feel like I asked that question a lot in these two documentaries. In this case, it all starts with an email chain that began slowly and then very rapidly deteriorated. Following the call we've just described, Riaz emailed Argo and Dora suggesting again that they could receive some shares in his new game studio. Having not heard back from them after a couple of weeks, Riaz emailed once more and said that he assumed Argo and Dora would be starting a new studio and that they may need to sign an offboarding agreement due to a non-compete clause in their contracts. The email even ends with this line: "I had thought we had taken those clauses out, but they seem to be in the agreement signed." Oof, if only. Now, these offboarding agreements, had Argo and Dora signed them, would have committed both of them to a number of things. First of all, it stated that they'd require written permission before discussing any of the work they did at Cogrammer, either publicly or privately. It would have also confirmed that the intellectual property that they'd created while at Cogrammer was indeed owned by the company and not by them. And then, in fact, when it came to the non-compete itself, this new agreement didn't actually release them from that clause right away. Instead, Argo and Dora would still need to wait until the beginning of the following year before any work on a new game studio could take place, effectively reducing that previous clause from 6 months to 3 months. It's worth noting that there is a difference in the language being used between that first contract and this offboarding agreement, whereas back then they signed something that said they can't work in a business that operates in a similar field to whatever work they were doing at Cogrammer. It's kind of a general catch-all clause. This language here very specifically says they can't start a video game studio. These agreements remained unsigned, and after sorting out an unpaid invoice, Argo suggested in a reply that they carry on discussing this offboarding process the following week instead. And it's here, in this moment, that everything just seems to turn. Unfortunately, we need to speak today, replied Riaz, who then points out that if the agreements aren't signed right away, legal action would likely follow. Argo replied, 1, if you feel I'm in breach of contract and wish to sue me, then why give me this document? 2, if you do not wish to sue me, then why not let me be for a few days, since I'm obviously busy? By the following day, Cogrammer's attorney had given Argo and Dora an ultimatum. Sign these agreements by 8 PM or the company is going to take you to court. Okay, let's put a pin in that back and forth for just a moment, because something else happens that very same day, the 10th of October, 2024. Both Argo and Dora receive urgent letters from our law firm representing not Cogrammer, but Zaum. And these letters state that the company has now been made aware that the two of them had a USB drive in their possession containing a playable build of Locust City, amongst other game assets, and that they should no longer have had that in their possession. The letter goes on to say that Zaum believed Argo and Dora had already shown the contents of this drive to members of Dartmouth Games, and perhaps others as well. It ends with a demand that they destroy any company property still in their possession, or they're going to face legal action on that front as well. Now, I don't know who informed Zaum of this alleged IP theft, but it does appear that Riaz was aware that these letters were going to be sent out 2 weeks prior to Argo and Dora having received them. In a recording shared with People Make Games of a call from September 2024, Riaz, Argo and Dora are discussing the pair's resignation letters that have just been submitted. Out of the blue, Riaz asks them, have you been contacted by Zaum yet? When Argo replies no and seems confused by the question, Riaz goes on to say, that IP you showed me, the sequel/DLC, I don't think you have permission to have it, right? Argo and Dora then tell him they don't know what he's talking about. The conversation then moved on to the resignations, and they don't return back to this topic, but I asked Argo if he remembered this particular exchange.
Out of nowhere, someone starts talking to in a way that as if we're both in the know about this. Clearly tell that he's recording and making these weird statements.
In Riaz Muller's witness statement submitted to court in October of last year, he includes more details as to what he alleges Argo and Dora had in their possession from their work on Locust City. This statement predates the leaked gameplay that we detailed earlier in the documentary and contains several quite specific details as to what he claims he was shown. Argo and Dora both deny that this USB drive has ever existed, and Zaum hasn't, as of yet, decided to take any further legal action. However, this alleged IP theft, it does make its way into those increasingly heated discussions about the offboarding agreements at Cogrammer. Let's go back to that email chain. On the afternoon of the 10th of October, that's the same day these letters were received, Riaz emailed Argo and Dora telling the pair that he didn't wish to fight them, but that he was under pressure from investors and others to make sure these agreements were signed, partly because of the Zaum IP he alleges they had shown him. Now, I do want to point out that there's no obvious link between these agreements that Riaz would like Argo and Dora to sign and this claim of IP theft from Zaum. The bundling of these two topics together in these emails is, well, it's confusing. Anyway, Argo replied, I have no Zaum IP at home or anywhere else. I don't work there and I used nothing of them from the time I worked there. Later on in his final email, Argo asked for a few more days in order to seek advice from his union's lawyer, to which Cogrammer's attorney responded that the company had now received confirmation that Argo and Dora were about to announce their new studio. He continued that an injunction was about to be filed unless the pair showed proof that they had retracted any plans to make such an announcement, and then he ends by telling them that the police have now been in touch with Cogrammer regarding this stolen Zaum IP, and these agreements have to be signed urgently. Now, there's an awful lot going on in these emails. In just the span of 3 days, it goes from, hey, would you like some new shares in this new studio that we're going to create? And oh, by the way, let's get you out of those non-compete clauses, to you're in breach of contract and we're taking you to court, and the police are banging on our door about a USB drive full of stolen game assets. If you, like me, are left wondering how on earth did this get out of hand so quickly, there is, I think, a hint in that final email that I just talked about from CodeGrammar's attorney. You see, there's another reason that Riaz would like Argo and Dora to sign these agreements right away, and there's a reason why they may have felt especially reluctant to do so, and it's to do with this announcement of a new studio. Because, as you may remember, the very next day, on the 11th of October 2024, just a few days prior to the 5th anniversary of Disco Elysium's release, Karo Kenda's Dark Math Games, Riaz Muller's newly formed Longdew Games, and Argo and Dora's Summer Eternal all go public, announcing their existence to the world at pretty much the same time. And of course, they're all vying for the attention of the very same audience, disco fans desperate for something that might be able to continue its legacy. This flurry of announcements, you'll be shocked to hear, was not exactly a coincidence. As CodeGrammar's attorney said in that final email, Riaz was aware that Argo and Dora were getting ready to announce Summer Eternal. This followed a bizarre mix-up in which both Argo and Longdew Games had both contacted the very same journalist at IGN, asking them to cover their upcoming announcements. Confused as to the difference between these two studios, the journalist had replied to Longdew's PR firm, explaining that Argo Tulik had already been in contact, assuming he was still employed there. These emails we've just gone through, they include a lot of different dynamics, but one of them undoubtedly is this power struggle over who is going to get to announce their game studio first. Remember here that the creation of a new game studio is specifically mentioned in these documents. Now, of course, it's CodeGrammar's belief that Argo and Dora's initial contracts with the company should have already ensured that no such announcement could be made. And so, with Summer Eternal having now gone public, CodeGrammar began its preparations to file a lawsuit against its former consultants for what it would claim to be a breach of contract. In the final days before this happened, there was one last-ditch attempt to settle. Dora emailed Riaz asking him to drop the legal action against them, and in exchange, Summer Eternal would agree to include messages of support for Longdew Games in its newsletter, social media posts, and in interviews with the press going forward. Riaz responded with a counteroffer of his own that would have seen Summer Eternal halting any marketing efforts for several months and commit to not carry out any crowdfunding until midway through the following year. He also, and this one did not land well, asked for first refusal for a six-figure investment in Argo and Dora's new studio, as well as, and I quote, a C-suite advisory title. Unsurprisingly, there was no settlement, and the case went on to be filed with the British courts. Longdew Games provided the following comment in relation to these discussions. Longdew offered to release Argo and Dora from their restraint of trade on 8th of October 2024 after being notified by a third party that they were about to announce a competing studio. Argo and Dora rejected this offer, and subsequent negotiations have taken place since Longdew won the court injunction. Longdew and its team have no interest in being involved in any venture run by Argo or Dora. At this point, CodeGrammer requested an immediate injunction be ordered, which the court granted, meaning that neither Argo or Dora were able to continue working on Summer Eternal until at least the 30th of March 2025, while both sides prepared for their day in court. This date has now passed, and Summer Eternal is officially up and running again, which the pair announced on X with the help of former US President Joe Biden. However, during this period of inactivity, Argo and Dora decided to leave the UK behind, opting for Dora's home country of Croatia instead. I asked the pair why they made this move.
Honestly, like more than anything, it was the finances because after paying these two different sets of fees, we were left with not enough money to pay rent next morning. Yeah. Like we got into a situation where we had enough money for fuel to Croatia, like for the van, and then already we had to borrow money from Dora's mom when the van broke down in France.
I think it's probably fair to say that getting out of the UK jurisdiction and also making it that much harder for CodeGrammar's lawyers to reach them going forward may have proven a factor here. But on that note of the financial burden of this, it is staggering. I understand the combined cost of the legal fees that have already been spent on this case before any hearing has actually been reached are already well into the six-figure territory. In fact, a recent letter sent by a law firm hired by CodeGrammer to Argo and Dora suggested that already on just the CodeGrammer side of this case, about £120,000 has already been spent. Argo, as we mentioned earlier in the video, has taken to crowdfunding in order to raise the money needed to mount their defense. But if this case isn't settled, whoever loses in court is going to be liable for a huge amount of cash. So what happens next? Well, as of right now, a hearing date hasn't yet been scheduled for this case, and so things could drag on for some time to come. But I mentioned a letter from CodeGrammar's law firm. Let's talk about that for a second. This letter included an offer to settle the case right now if Argo and Dora agreed to pay Codegrammer in excess of £90,000. And more than that, it also suggested that if this doesn't happen, there may be a second lawsuit to come in which Argo Tulik could be sued for defamation based on comments he's made on social media and on his crowdfunding page as well. On that note, we've been advised not to quote anything directly from that crowdfunding page, but needless to say, it does not paint a flattering picture of Argo's feelings towards Riaz Muller. So that's where things stand as we publish this documentary. Both Longdew Games and Summer Eternal are busy working on their respective projects, but this lawsuit hangs so heavy over both of them. The legal fees alone, outside of any damages that may or may not be awarded, are truly significant. And so winning, losing, or settling is going to be all about who picks up that bill in the end. Now, I don't have a position on who's going to win this case if and when it does get to court, but what I do want to say is this entire lawsuit, this 6-figure lawsuit that could take a couple of years if things go slowly, it all comes down to, in the end, a period of employment of less than 7.5 weeks. That seems mad. With that in mind, the sheer amount of money and energy that's being spent to fight this battle, it's mind-blowing. That's money and energy that could have gone into the games that these two studios, Longdew Games and Summer Eternal, are actually trying to make. But no, here we are again with a lawsuit that is just swallowing up all of that oxygen instead. Okay, given it's been a little while in this documentary about Disco Elysium since I've actually said the words Disco Elysium, let me end with this final connection between the lawsuit we've just described and that original game, because it's not one I'd been expecting. You see, given the expenses incurred and the stress induced and everything I've just said about how these lawsuits swallow up everything else, I was very, very surprised to hear that Argo Tulik is considering another one. I can barely believe I'm about to say this. He's got his eyes set on the ownership of the Elysium world.
In the end of the day, I feel this is something that needs to happen. There are many reasons from that, starting from kind of a promise that I made even in the GoFundMe, that anything remaining will be put into this attempt to recapture the IP. Like the little, or not even that little, but the few conversations I've had with lawyers both in UK and in Estonia, they are very encouraging. I guess lawyers are always encouraging because you are gonna be using their services.
Argo's case centers around who actually owned the Elysium property to begin with. Yes, he points out Robert Kurwitz is single-handedly more responsible for Disco Elysium than any other person, but he also argues that if you look back at those original tabletop games where Elysium was first dreamt up, yes, Robert was the game master of those sessions, but Argo, as well as Martin Luiga, the former member of the Zaum Cultural Collective, they were its main players. Is it then fair to say that Robert created all of it?
The beginning of Zaum was very sloppy in a way that nobody questioned this kind of validity of decision of letting Robert sign off characters that Luix and myself wrote, for example. By now it is already pretty public knowledge that both like the first round of investments Zaum ever received was for the pitch called Thorson and McLean, which is direct descendant of this tabletop session where Luix played Chester McLean, I played Mac Thorson. And in a way I was hoping that maybe we could all join forces, Luix, Robert and myself, and I proposed this to Red Info through their CEO. But the reception was kind of lukewarm, and in a way I understand that from their end as well, they are already, is it 6 lawsuits deep, like Robert is, that in order to pursue this joint operation, I think they would have to retract the other ones. But ultimately, in the end of the day, yes, when this wraps up, we will make an attempt for the IP, and we're not asking Zaum to hand over the resources or anything else but the right to work in the world of Elysium.
I think there's going to be some poetry if in the end what brings Elysium home is this desire to admit that like there was not one single creator but a group.
So what would that even look like? Let's say Argo somehow won this case. Who would get to work in the world of Elysium going forward?
Robert, myself, Luiga, and I guess Zaum as well would be able to work with Elysium IP. I think that seems to be the fair split. I would honestly be even happy with the scenario where we just get it back to Robert, because kind of like he really went through a meat grinder, and I may not approve his methodology or like sometimes the care he shows to people around him, but in the end of the day, like without him there wouldn't be Elysium. Like you can remove each and every other one of us and you still get a Elysium, a version of Elysium, even if this end result is that he can just, even for himself, sit home and write Elysium stuff. I think that's fair. I think this balance has been restored. I don't particularly feel that I need to be writing in the world of Elysium. Like it's still something I'm interested, of course, but this realization, what a burden it is simultaneously to being like this the most desirable object, Elysium, because like while you have it, like you can't do anything else. Like for example, like if Robert gets it back, like he will never move out of it. Like this is like the one ring from Lord of the Rings. You cannot give up on it, and even this envy and this negative attention that it attracts from people like Riias, like it's an enormous burden. But more than anything, like I got to feel this sudden spaciousness of not getting to do Elysium, having to think, what else do I actually want to do?
That is a crazy, having followed you through this story, I understand where that comes from, but that is a crazy way to describe a thing that first started with a group of friends playing tabletop games in Estonia. That feels like maybe the most appropriate place to end this follow-up, I think. We're not going to find a better way to bring together all the different threads of this story than a last-minute Hail Mary attempt for the rights to Disco Elysium. I don't really have that much else to say, honestly. This story has swallowed People Make Games whole once again, and yeah, we've never reflected on a previous documentary in this way before. We've never tried to contain so many different moving parts in one video, and we've certainly never spent this much on legal advice either. I have no idea what the reaction to this documentary is going to be, but I'm just glad that we finally made it. And as I said earlier, the only reason we're able to return to this topic, the only reason we're able to take a proper swing at it, is because we're supported directly by our audience. It's meant we've had the time and the resources needed to try and do this the way we think it should be done. And so, if you believe games journalism deserves real investigative work, please do consider supporting us on patreon.com/peoplemakegames, because that's what we believe too, and we could use your help. Is that it? Is that how we're ending this? Am I free? I guess so. Thank you very much for watching.